Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're diving back into the Mandate for Leadership, the Conservative Promise today. A lot of you asked about pages 700 to 800, so we're going to tackle those. Yeah, the proposed changes to the Treasury Department and the Small Business Administration. Get ready. It's a wild ride.
Yeah, what's really interesting is how this section just jumps right into suggesting some major changes, like complete overhauls. They really dig into the inner workings of these institutions with a clear goal to empower businesses and individuals, really, while also pulling back on government intervention.
All right, so let's start with the IRS. The source basically calls it mismanaged and politicized. They're not exactly sugarcoating it, are they?
Not at all. They go on to suggest some really bold solutions, simplifying the tax code, which honestly would be a relief for everyone, not just the IRS. But they also want to see stronger taxpayer rights
And wage.
more transparency. Can you imagine actually understanding your taxes?
That would be nice, wouldn't it? But it's not just about, like, rule changes, is it? The source talks about changing the entire culture within the IRS itself.
That's right. They're arguing that a real overhaul requires a change in mindset, a culture of service and efficiency, not just enforcing rules for the sake of enforcing rules,
Interesting. It's like they want to take the IRS and, like, flip it on its head, make it less Big Brother and more like, I don't know, a helpful neighbor.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And the Treasury Department as a whole, they're not off the hook either. The source suggests restructuring it pretty dramatically, really. They even talk about bringing back some agencies, like the Coast Guard and the ATF.
Hold on, they want to bring back the Coast Guard to the Treasury? I mean, that just seems, I don't know, odd.
Well, the idea is to have a more unified front against threats to border security and to better combat economic crimes, things like smuggling.
Okay, I'm starting to see the logic here. But hasn't this sort of restructuring happened before? What can we learn from those, I don't know, those past experiences?
That's a really good question, and it's one the source doesn't really address. It would be fascinating to see how these departmental shifts have played out in history and what lessons they might hold for this proposal.
Definitely food for thought. All right, next we have the Export-Import Bank, or EXIM. Now, this is where things get tricky. The source gives us two very different perspectives on this one.
Yeah, it's a classic debate, On one hand, some see EXIM as basically corporate welfare, benefiting mainly large companies that don't really need help.
So like a handout to the big guys.
Exactly. But on the other hand, you have those who see EXIM as essential for competing in a global market, especially against heavy hitters like China. They argue that EXIM levels the playing field and protects American interests against, aggressive tactics from other countries.
So it's kind of a David and Goliath situation,
Yeah.
with America needing EXIM to hold its own.
That's a good way to frame it. And the source doesn't say who's right or wrong, but it does highlight, the economic factors at play and the geopolitical ones, too. It's a decision with major consequences, especially given the current tensions with China.
Yeah, no kidding. All right, let's move on to the SBA, Small Business Administration. The source seems to have, I don't know, mixed feelings about it.
It's a bit of a mixed bag, yeah. On one hand, they acknowledge how vital the SBA is for small businesses, especially during tough times like the COVID pandemic. But they also point to waste and fraud, particularly with the EIDL program.
So the SBA is a powerful tool that can be misused, almost like a chainsaw, helpful for some things, but dangerous in the wrong hands.
I like that, yeah. The source stresses the need for tighter controls and more accountability. We need to make sure those SBA resources are going to all eligible businesses, not just, certain favored groups.
It sounds like they're calling for the SBA to refocus, get back to basics, make sure it's fulfilling its original mission.
Absolutely. And that reflects a bigger trend we see throughout these recommendations, a government that empowers rather than overreaches, a government that's efficient, accountable.
Yeah, I'm seeing that too. And speaking of, the global landscape, the source also touches on international trade. And again, there's China. What's their take this time?
They recommend a multi-pronged approach, balancing free trade principles with the need to protect American interests. It's a delicate act,
So how do they propose we, I don't know, walk that tightrope?
They suggest reevaluating trade agreements, like the CPAC-TPP, that's the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. They also suggest targeted tariffs as a tool to counter, unfair trade practices, especially from China.
So tariffs. Isn't that risky? Could spark a trade war?
It is a calculated risk. And they acknowledge that, but they believe it's sometimes necessary to play hardball, to protect American jobs and industries. Remember, this source puts American interests first, even if it ruffles some feathers on the international stage.
Okay, so using those tools strategically to level the playing field.
Exactly. It's not about protectionism for the sake of it. It's about being smart and strategic, especially when it comes to China, which they see as a major challenge. That needs to be addressed head on.
Yeah, that's some food for thought. All right, so we've covered a lot. IRS reform, restructuring the Treasury Department, the exime dilemma, revamping the SBA, and even dipped our toes into the world of international trade, with China looming large. Ew.
It's a lot, right? But I think a clear theme is emerging. It's all about creating a level playing field for American businesses and individuals.
Yeah, it's like they're saying, let's give people the tools and the freedom to succeed, but also make sure the government's not in the way, not picking winners and losers.
I like that. And what really strikes me is how they emphasize understanding a global economy. We can't just look at policies in isolation. We need to understand the broader context of international trade and competition, especially in relation to China. It's a complex world out there.
I hear you. I'm already feeling like I need a whiteboard to connect all these dots.
Right. Well, let's leave it there for now. Let everyone process. In the next part, we'll look at how this source tackles other departments and agencies, things like Homeland Security and FEMA. You might be surprised.
Ooh, sounds intriguing. I'm ready for more, but for now, let's give our listeners a moment to digest. We'll be back soon with more from the Mandate for Leadership. Don't go anywhere.
Welcome back to the deep dive. It really is fascinating how much ground the Mandate for Leadership covers.
Seriously, it feels like we just got started. We dove deep into the Treasury Department and the SBA, and, well, now I'm ready for round two. What other juicy policy recommendations are hiding in this thing?
Well, we've been talking about bolstering American businesses and navigating that whole global economy thing. So why don't we shift gears a bit, see how this source tackles a totally different challenge, immigration.
Oh, immigration. Yeah, that's always a hot topic. What's their take?
Get this. They're proposing a total 180 on immigration enforcement. Like, picture this detention space, totally maximized, very limited use of alternatives parole. Forget about it. Only in extreme cases, humanitarian or public benefit. And even then, only with the Secretary's approval.
Wow, that's a pretty big shift from what we've been seeing lately. Sounds like they're taking a much stricter approach.
Absolutely. They even want to give ICE more power to enforce immigration laws. They actually suggest bringing back Blackie's warrants for workplace raids.
Blackie's warrants. Huh, I've never heard of those. What are they?
They're these administrative warrants that let ICE agents enter workplaces, places suspected of employing undocumented immigrants.
Ah, I see.
They've been kind of controversial in the past, worries about abuse, racial profiling, that sort of thing. But this source, they see them as a necessary tool for cracking down on illegal immigration.
So it's not just about border security. It's about addressing illegal immigration inside the country, too.
Exactly. It's a multi-pronged approach, targeting both the flow of undocumented immigrants across the border and those already here, living and working.
Okay, I get it. So, shifting gears again, let's talk FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency. What's their take on that?
Well, they think FEMA is often stretched too thin, forced to pick up the slack when states and local governments aren't prepared enough. It's like that friend who always forgets to pack for a camping trip and expects you to bring everything.
Yeah, I know that friend. And yeah, it definitely puts a strain on everyone.
Right. And this source worries that it leaves FEMA less prepared for the really big ones, the truly catastrophic events. So they're calling for a shift back to federalism, states and local governments taking more responsibility for disaster preparedness. FEMA would then focus on those massive, overwhelming disasters, the ones that truly require a national response.
Okay, so it's like everyone getting their own house in order before the big one hits.
Exactly. And while we're on the topic of agencies maybe needing to streamline, they have some interesting thoughts on the Coast Guard.
The Coast Guard. Really?
Yeah, they suggest scaling back some of their missions, to better align with congressional budgeting. They're not saying abandon core responsibilities, but just making sure the Coast Guard is equipped for what's most essential. Focusing acquisitions based on an updated fleet mix analysis, basically making sure they've got the right ships and resources for the job.
So, right-sizing the Coast Guard. Making sure it's lean and efficient, but still capable.
That's the idea. They even suggest integrating the Coast Guard's shipbuilding plan with the Navy's long-range plan, Makes sense, right? Avoid duplication. Maximize efficiency.
Yeah, makes sense. Like coordinating your grocery list with your roommate so you don't end up with 3 gallons of milk.
Haha, exactly. Okay, moving on to an agency with a very specific and high-pressure job. The U.S. Secret Service. The folks who protect the president and other VIPs.
Talk about pressure. What do they recommend for the Secret Service?
Well, they're worried about the agency's dual mission protection A&D financial investigations. Like, think about it. Guarding the president and investigating counterfeit money, pretty different skill sets.
Yeah, that's putting it mildly. It does seem like trying to master 2 totally different things could be a problem.
Right, and that's what the source argues. They say this split focus has led to security lapses, embarrassing incidents. So they recommend separating those functions. Let the Secret Service focus on what they do best, protecting people.
Keep it simple.
Right.
Protection is their primary job.
Right.
They need to be the best in the world at it.
Absolutely. Now, shifting gears again, from protection to diplomacy, what does this source have in store for the State Department?
International relations.
Yeah.
This should be good.
Well, they want a more constitutionally sound approach to treaties and international agreements. It's like hitting pause on any ongoing negotiations, taking a good, hard look at whether they align with the new president's foreign policy goals.
So taking stock, reassessing priorities, making sure those agreements really serve America's interests.
Exactly. And they go even further. They want to stop enforcing treaties that haven't been officially ratified by the Senate. It's all about respecting the Constitution, upholding the Senate's role in treaty making.
And as you think about those checks and balances, right? The ones built into our system of government.
It does. And speaking of checks and balances, this source doesn't shy away from the elephant in the room when it comes to global affairs. China.
We talk about China in terms of trade, but it sounds like their concerns go beyond just the economic stuff.
They do. They call for a clear-eyed approach to China, recognizing its growing influence, but also, the potential threats. It's not about fear-mongering, but about being realistic.
So acknowledging the challenges, but not overreacting.
That's it. And they emphasize strengthening relationships with key allies, like India, recognizing the strategic importance of that region, and counterbalancing China's influence.
Like building a network, a strong network,
Yeah.
to face a common challenge.
That's a great analogy. They also suggest being more strategic with aid and development, especially in the Middle East. It's not about throwing money at problems, but about using aid to promote self-reliance, sustainable development. They're critical of what they see as a return to aid dependency under previous administrations.
So helping nations become partners, not dependents.
Right. Now, let's step into the world of intelligence. The intelligence community. The folks who gather secrets, assess threats, that whole cloak and dagger thing.
Ooh, spies and secrets. I'm listening.
They want a depoliticized intelligence apparatus, one that prioritizes protecting America's civil liberties and security. It's about objectivity, professionalism, not using intelligence for political gain.
Yeah, depoliticizing intelligence. I think a lot of people would agree on that. What specific steps do they suggest?
Accountability, holding those who abuse their power accountable. A system where intelligence officials can't just act with impunity. And of course, a laser focus on emerging threats and technologies, particularly those coming from potential adversaries like, China.
So being proactive, anticipating future challenges.
Yeah.
Even if it means studying technologies we don't currently possess.
That's it. Staying ahead of the curve, not playing catch up. And speaking of the intelligence community, we can't forget the CIA. What do they have in mind for them?
Yeah, what about the CIA?
More oversight of their activities, especially covert operations, making sure everything aligns with official State Department policy. It's about keeping everyone on the same page, avoiding those rogue agent scenarios you see in movies.
No more Jason Bourne going off script.
Exactly. And they're very careful about intelligence sharing. They acknowledge the importance of working with allies, but they stress protecting sources and methods. It's a tough balance.
I can see that share too much and you compromise security, but not sharing enough can hinder cooperation. Tough call.
It is. But they do suggest exploring expanded intelligence sharing with countries like those in the Quad, the U.S., Japan, Australia, and India, as a way to, counter China's influence.
The Quad, yeah, that's a powerful group. So being strategic about who we share with, focusing on building alliances to face common threats.
Exactly. And of course, no conversation about intelligence is complete these days without talking about cybersecurity.
Cybersecurity.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like every other day there's a new hack or data breach.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little scary.
It is a huge concern. And this source wants a proactive approach to sharing cyber threat intelligence with the private sector and the public. It's like arming everyone with the knowledge they need to defend themselves.
Right. If everyone's more informed, they can be better prepared. Knowledge is power.
That's it. They also emphasize research and development in areas like artificial intelligence.
Right.
But with a focus on avoiding duplication of private sector efforts, it's about the government investing in areas where it can have the most impact.
So focusing on what the government does best, not trying to compete with the private sector.
Right. Now, let's go from cyberspace to outer space, because this source sees space as increasingly important in the intelligence arena.
Space, the final frontier. Now, this is where it gets really interesting.
They want better integration of space assets, exploring joint programs, fully utilizing the unique authorities of both the Defense Department and the intelligence community. They even talk about executing space defense and potentially even offensive strategies.
Hold on, space offense. That sounds like something straight out of Star Wars.
I know, right? It suggests a much more assertive posture in space. And they also see potential for building international alliances beyond traditional partners like the Five Eyes nations, the US, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand.
So recognizing that space is becoming more contested, and we need to be prepared to operate there effectively, maybe with some new partners.
Exactly. And speaking of partners, they also highlight the need to attract and retain top talent in the intelligence field. People with expertise in cutting-edge technologies, cybersecurity experts, AI specialists, space engineers, the best and brightest.
We definitely need those folks on our side. Okay, from space back to Earth, let's talk about U.S. global media.
They're actually pretty worried about security vulnerabilities within the U.S. Agency for Global Media, or USAGM. That's the agency that oversees things like Voice of America and Radio Free Europe. They point to past investigations that revealed serious security lapses, a failure to properly vet staff.
Wait, serious security lapses in our own global media agency. That's not good.
It's not good at all. And they call for a complete overhaul of security practices, stronger focus on counterintelligence. They even suggest downsizing the agency. It's like they're saying, let's make sure our own house is in order before we try to project our message to the world.
Makes sense, right? You can't be a credible voice on the global stage if your own organization is compromised.
Exactly. And they also want objectivity and balance in USAGM programming. No more pushing a particular political ideology. It's about presenting accurate and unbiased information to the world.
Restoring trust and credibility in U.S. global media.
That's the goal. Now, shifting from media to international aid, let's look at what they propose for USA, the Agency for International Development.
USA, yeah, they do a lot of work around the world, providing assistance and all.
They do. And this source wants a big shift in approach, moving away from what they call woke policies, back to core development goals, poverty reduction, economic growth, good governance.
Less social engineering, more practical stuff.
Exactly. And they want to partner with faith-based organizations and private sector entities to leverage their expertise and resources.
So tapping into existing networks and capabilities to achieve development goals.
Right. And they're very aware of China's growing influence in the developing world. They want USA to counter that and promote American values and interests.
So it's not just about providing aid, it's about competing with China for hearts and minds.
Exactly. They also call for a more holistic approach to healthcare, focusing on family stability, addressing issues like maternal and infant mortality.
So looking beyond just treating diseases, considering the social factors that affect health.
Right. They're also critical of the focus on abortion as a form of healthcare. They argue it doesn't address the root causes of high maternal and infant mortality rates.
Yeah, that's a controversial issue. It reflects their pro-life stance.
It does. And they want a market-oriented approach to development, promoting free trade, reducing barriers to entrepreneurship.
So creating an environment where people can lift themselves out of poverty, not just relying on aid.
That's the goal. And they highlight the importance of empowering women and girls, but not through what they call a gender ideology lens.
So focusing on practical needs and opportunities, not just pushing a particular ideology.
Right. Okay, let's turn our attention to a department that impacts all Americans. The Department of Health and Human Services, or HHS.
HHS, that's a big one.
Yeah.
Medicare, Medicaid, the FDA, the CDC.
Huge. And they are very critical of what they call runaway entitlements. They argue these programs stifle medical innovation and make healthcare more expensive.
So they want to reform those programs, like Medicare and Medicaid, make them more sustainable.
Exactly. They want to empower individuals to make their own healthcare decisions, Promote competition in the market. Give doctors more freedom to practice medicine without excessive government interference.
So, less government involvement in healthcare.
Let
And the free market work its magic.
That's the gist of it. They also criticize the close relationship between government agencies like the NIH and CDC and pharmaceutical companies. They worry about conflicts of interest.
Yeah, the revolving door between government and industry. Always a concern.
Right. And they're not fans of what they call junk science and the politicization of research, especially in areas like gender and sexuality.
So calling for a return to rigorous, objective scientific inquiry.
Precisely. And they're strong on protecting conscience rights, especially for healthcare providers who object to performing abortions or other procedures that violate their religious beliefs.
Again, that aligns with their pro-life stance and their emphasis on religious freedom.
It does.
Yeah.
Now, from healthcare, let's move to an area that literally feeds America, the Department of Agriculture, or the USDA.
The USDA, food safety farm subsidies, rural development, they've got a lot on their plate.
They do. And the source wants a back-to-basics approach, focusing on supporting American farmers and ranchers and ensuring a safe and abundant food supply. They're critical of the emphasis on transforming the food system, to fit a particular political agenda.
Less focus on trendy food fads, more on the fundamentals.
Exactly. They want less government intervention, let farmers and ranchers make their own decisions, get rid of unnecessary regulations, all that red tape that farmers always complain about.
Get the government out of the fields. Let farmers do what they do best, grow food.
Love it. And they want to reform those farm subsidies too, make them more market-oriented, less likely to distort the market.
Yeah, that's been a debate for a long time. How to support farmers without creating unintended consequences.
It's complicated. They also want to reform conservation programs, make sure they're effective, and don't unnecessarily restrict how farmers can use their land.
Finding that balance between conservation and the needs of working farmers.
Right. And they want to make food assistance programs like SNME more market-oriented too. SNIP is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. They want to make sure those programs are targeted to those who truly need them and don't discourage work.
So a focus on self-sufficiency, avoiding dependency.
Exactly. They're also critical of the expansion of school meal programs. They say they've become too costly and don't always provide nutritious options.
That's been a hot topic, especially with concerns about childhood obesity.
It has. They want more parental control over children's diets, less federal overreach.
So less government mandates, more individual choice when it comes to school lunches.
That's the idea. Now, from food on our tables to the education of our children, let's dive into the Department of Education.
The Department of Education, they have a huge impact on the future of our kids.
They do. And get this, the source wants to drastically downsize the whole department. They argue that most of its functions should go back to states and local communities.
Wow, that's a big change, moving away from federal involvement in education.
It is. They see the federal government's role as limited, ensuring equal opportunity, protecting civil rights, not dictating curriculum or imposing a one-size-fits-all approach.
So less power in Washington, more power in the hands of states and local school districts.
Exactly. And they're big on school choice, giving parents the power to decide where their children go to school, public, private, or charter.
School choice. Yeah, that's a controversial one.
Yeah.
Strong opinions on both sides.
For sure. But this source sees it as a fundamental right. Parents should choose the best educational options for their kids. They also want to roll back federal regulations and mandates. They say those stifle creativity and innovation in the classroom.
Less red tape. More flexibility for teachers and schools.
Exactly. And a renewed focus on academic excellence. Back to basics. Reading, writing, math, science, make sure kids have the skills they need to succeed.
That sounds good to me. They also talk about protecting parental rights when it comes to their children's upbringing, especially sex education.
Another hot button issue. They believe parents should have the final say in what their children are exposed to.
More parental control, less government intrusion.
Exactly. Now, from education to energy, what's their vision for the Department of Energy?
The Department of Energy, they handle everything. Nuclear weapons, renewable energy research, those energy efficiency standards that make our appliances more expensive.
They do cover a lot of ground. And the source wants a major shift in energy policy, away from the focus on green initiatives. They want a balanced approach. Embrace all forms of energy.
So less about picking winners and losers in the energy market, more about letting all technologies compete.
That's it. They say too much government intervention has distorted the market, led to inefficiencies, higher costs for consumers.
Let the free market decide which energy sources work best.
Exactly. And they're especially interested in nuclear energy. They see it as a safe, reliable, and clean source of power, one that's been unfairly demonized.
Nuclear energy. Controversial, but they seem to think it's key to America's energy future.
They do. They also want a streamlined permitting process for energy projects. They say the current system is too bureaucratic, takes too long, hinders innovation and investment.
Yeah, that's a common complaint. Projects can take years to get approved.
It's a problem. They want to get rid of those roadblocks, make it easier to bring new energy projects online. They also want to see less government funding for what they call applied energy programs. They argue the private sector is better at developing and deploying new energy technologies.
Less government subsidies, more reliance on the free market.
That's the goal. And they want to reform FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Make sure it focuses on market fundamentals, doesn't favor particular energy sources.
So a neutral approach to regulating the energy market.
Exactly. They also want to reform the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC streamline the approval process for new nuclear reactors, and make it easier to extend the licenses of existing ones.
Sounds like they're serious about expanding nuclear energy.
They are. And they want to clean up radioactive waste from past nuclear weapons programs. But they want increased private sector involvement.
Using the private sector to address environmental challenges.
Right.
Interesting.
Right. Now, from energy to the environment, what do they have in mind for the EPA?
The EPA, keeping our air and water clean, protecting us from pollution. What's their take?
They're calling for a back-to-basics approach, focusing on those core functions: clean air, clean water, cut back on regulations, and bureaucratic overreach.
So a leaner, more efficient EPA.
That's it. Smaller budget rollback of programs they consider unauthorized or expired, and a more transparent and accountable approach to science and regulation.
Making sure the EPA is based on sound science, not overstepping its bounds.
Good summary. They also want to reform the agency's advisory committees. Make sure they represent a diverse range of perspectives and expertise, not just those who support a particular political agenda.
So more balanced and objective advice.
Exactly. They also want to strengthen property rights. Limit the use of eminent domain. When the government takes private property for public use, they're especially concerned about using eminent domain for environmental purposes.
Yeah, that's a big concern for property owners,
Mhm.
especially in rural areas.
It is. They see it as infringing on individual liberty, violating the Constitution.
So protecting private property rights is a priority.
Absolutely. And finally, they want a more collaborative approach to environmental regulation, working with states and local communities to find solutions that work for them.
Recognizing that one-size-fits-all mandates from Washington don't always work.
Right. They want flexibility, innovation in environmental policy.
So a more decentralized approach.
Yeah.
More market-oriented.
That's a great way to put it. Now let's move on from protecting the environment to managing America's vast public lands. What does the source have in store for the Department of the Interior?
The Department of the Interior National Parks, forests, wildlife refuges, all those amazing places.
That's right. And they have some strong opinions about how those lands should be managed. They call for a balanced approach, one that recognizes the multiple uses of public lands: energy development, recreation, conservation.
So not just preserving those lands, but allowing for responsible development and use.
Exactly. They're critical of what they see as a bias toward preservation, a disregard for the economic benefits that can come from using public lands responsibly.
Finding a balance, protecting those lands, but also allowing them to contribute to the economy.
That's the goal. And they want to streamline the permitting process for energy projects on public lands, make it less bureaucratic, less time-consuming.
Yeah, the permitting process can take forever.
It can. And they say it's costing jobs, hindering America's energy independence.
So make it easier to develop our own energy resources.
Exactly. They also want a smaller federal footprint. When it comes to managing those lands, they think states and local communities can make better decisions.
So shifting power back to the states, like they want to do with education.
Exactly. A more decentralized approach. Less bureaucracy. That's a common theme.
Empowering those closest to the issues.
That's it. And they want a more market-oriented approach, too, encouraging private sector involvement in things like timber harvesting and grazing.
Leveraging the private sector to manage those resources.
Right. And they want to reduce the regulatory burden, too. They say it's become too much, too costly.
Make it easier for ranchers, loggers, miners to operate on public lands without being stifled by regulations.
Exactly. And they want to reform the Endangered Species Act, too. They argue it's too cumbersome, often hinders economic development without actually protecting species.
The Endangered Species Act, always controversial.
It is. This source wants a more balanced approach. species protection, and economic growth.
Finding that middle ground.
Exactly. Okay, let's move on from public lands to upholding the law. What does the source have in mind for the Department of Justice? The DOJ?
The DOJ enforcing federal law, fighting crime, ensuring justice.
That's right. And they're calling for a restoration of law and order, a crackdown on crime, a more aggressive approach to prosecuting criminals.
So a tough-on-crime stance.
Absolutely. They're critical of what they see as a soft-on-crime approach. They want to end catch-and-release policies, where criminals are arrested but then released right back onto the streets.
Yeah, that's been a concern in some cities.
It has. And they want tougher sentencing guidelines. They say the current laws are too lenient. They also want more support for law enforcement, give them the resources and training they need to do their jobs effectively.
Back the blue. Make sure police officers can keep our communities safe.
Exactly. They're also calling for reforms to the criminal justice system,
Mm-hmm.
but their focus is on making sure justice is served, not on coddling criminals.
So considering the rights of victims as well as the accused.
Right. And they want to crack down on illegal immigration, too. They argue it fuels crime and undermines national security.
Immigration. Another hot-button issue.
Always. They want stronger border security, more enforcement within the country, an end to sanctuary city policies that shield illegal immigrants from deportation.
So a tough stance on illegal immigration, in line with their focus on law and order.
Exactly. They also want a more aggressive approach to combating terrorism domestically and internationally.
Terrorism, a constant threat.
It is. They want stronger intelligence capabilities,
Yeah.
a more proactive approach to disrupting terrorist networks, and a willingness to use force to protect America.
So a strong national security posture
Yeah.
focused on prevention.
Exactly. They also call for reforms to the FBI. They say it's become too politicized, strayed from its core mission of law enforcement.
The FBI, they've been in the news a lot lately.
They have, and this source wants them to get back to basics,
Yeah.
investigating and prosecuting crime, not engaging in political witch hunts or targeting people based on their beliefs.
A more objective and professional FBI, focused on the law, not a particular agenda.
That's what they want. They also want a smaller role for the federal government in law enforcement. They think states and local communities can handle most crime problems.
Again, a more decentralized approach, like they propose for other areas.
Exactly. Less federal overreach. More power to states and local communities.
Let those closest to the problems find solutions.
That's it. They're also strong advocates for religious freedom. They say it's under attack.
Religious freedom is a fundamental right, but it does seem like it's facing more challenges these days.
It is. They want the government to actively defend the right to practice faith freely, without fear of discrimination or persecution.
So a strong stance on protecting religious liberty.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, from upholding the law to protecting workers' rights, let's see what the source has to say about the Department of Labor, the DOL.
The deal, safe workplaces, fair wages, workers' rights.
That's right. And this source wants to move away from what they see as an overly burdensome regulatory approach, the kind of regulations that stifle job creation and economic growth.
So a more business-friendly approach, less regulation, a more flexible labor market.
That's the idea. Too many regulations make it harder to hire workers. They stifle innovation.
Finding that sweet spot, protecting workers, but also allowing businesses to thrive.
Exactly. They also want to reform unions. They argue they've become too powerful and often act in their own interests, not the interests of their members.
Unions, a big part of American history. But they've also been criticized for being too adversarial, sometimes putting their own interests first.
That's the critique this source is making. They want unions to be more accountable to their members, less focused on politics.
A more balanced approach to labor relations, recognizing the rights of both workers and employers.
Precisely. And when it comes to wages, they're all about a market-oriented approach. They say government mandates like the minimum wage distort the market, lead to job losses.
The minimum wage debate, it never goes away.
It's a tough one. Strong opinions on both sides. This source wants wages to be determined by supply and demand. The free market, not the government.
So a free market approach to wages.
That's it. They also want to reform unemployment insurance. They say it's become too generous, discourages people from looking for work.
Unemployment insurance is a safety net. But I have heard the argument that it can sometimes discourage people from looking for work.
Right, it's supposed to help people get back on their feet. But this source, they think it's gone too far. They want to make it more temporary. Stronger incentives for people to get back to work sooner rather than later.
Okay, make it more about getting back to work, not about, becoming dependent.
That's the idea. And they also want to reform retirement savings plans. Make them more portable, more affordable. Give individuals more control over their own investments.
Yeah, retirement security is a big worry for a lot of people. How do they want to tackle that?
More choices, more control over their savings, less reliance on government programs, more emphasis on individual responsibility, market-based solutions.
So a more individualistic approach to retirement.
You got it. And have you heard about all those occupational licensing laws? The ones that require licenses for practically every profession?
Oh yeah, it seems like you need a license for everything these days.
I know, right? And the source thinks a lot of those licensing requirements are more about protecting those who are already in the profession, not really about ensuring quality or safety.
So open up those markets.
Hmm.
More competition.
That's the idea. Oh, and another thing. They want to limit the power of government agencies to issue those guidance documents, the ones that basically act like laws, even though they don't go through the proper rulemaking process.
I have heard about those. It's like a way for agencies to make new rules without any real oversight.
Exactly. More transparency, accountability,
Yeah.
make sure regulations are based on, solid evidence, not just political agendas.
Regulations should be reasonable, shouldn't create burdens on businesses and workers.
Okay, so, wow, we've covered a lot. But there's a clear theme here. Less government, more individual empowerment, free markets. You got it. But there's more. This source isn't afraid of specifics, and they've got a lot to say about transportation.
Transportation, that's a big one. Highways, bridges, airlines, pipelines. Where do they even start?
Well, their approach is consistent with what we've seen already. A more market-oriented system, less government involvement, less regulation.
So let the private sector handle transportation.
That's it. Less government means more efficiency, lower costs, more innovation.
Okay, so get the government out of the driver's seat, huh?
Haha, I like that. For example, they want to repeal the Jones Act. They see it as protectionist hurts consumers.
The Jones Act, always a controversial one.
Definitely. They also want to reform the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, too much bureaucracy, not enough efficiency.
Yeah, air travel has become a real hassle. Delays, cancellations, fees.
Yeah.
It's a mess.
I know. They want a more streamlined FAA focused on customers, one that embraces new technologies and innovations.
Make flying less of a headache. I'm all for that. What about Amtrak? Passenger rail service.
Oh, they're not fans of Amtrak. They call it a money pit. They want to privatize it.
Amtrak's always on the chopping block. Some say it's not the government's job to run a railroad.
This source agrees. They think the private sector can do it better without all those government subsidies.
Okay, so a pretty hands-off approach to transportation. But what about veterans? Those who have served our country.
They want to make sure veterans get the care and support they deserve. A VA that's efficient, effective, focused on veterans' needs.
So a VA that actually works for veterans, not against them.
Exactly. Streamline the disability claims process, expand access to mental health care, improve the quality of care at VA hospitals, things like that.
Yeah, those are all critical areas for veterans.
Yeah.
They've faced a lot of challenges getting the care they need.
They have. And this source wants to give veterans more choices. Let them see private doctors if they want.
That's been a controversial idea. Some worry about undermining the VA.
It has. But the source thinks it would give veterans more control, make sure they get the best care, whether it's from the VA or a private doctor.
So putting veterans first, giving them choices.
Exactly. And they want to see more done about veteran suicide. It's a tragedy.
It is. We need to do everything we can to prevent it.
Right. More funding for mental health care, outreach programs, support services for PTSD and other issues.
Support veterans, help them heal.
Exactly. Okay, last but not least, international trade.
Trade. Yeah, can't talk about policy without talking about trade, especially with China in the picture.
Right. This source has a very clear vision, a more strategic, assertive approach to trade. Less about those big free trade agreements, more about protecting American jobs and businesses.
America first when it comes to trade.
You got it. They argue that past trade deals, especially with China, have cost us jobs. Closed factories hurt American manufacturing.
Yeah, there's a sense that we're losing ground in the global economy.
And they want to renegotiate those deals, make sure they're fair to American workers, and when it comes to China, they want to get tough.
Tough. What does that mean?
Tariff sanctions. Whatever it takes to pressure China to change its ways.
Could lead to a trade war, though.
It could, and they know that. But they think it's worth the risk to protect American interests.
So standing up to China, not just going along with whatever they do.
Exactly. And they also want to work with our allies, the ones who share our concerns about China.
Strength in numbers, right? A coalition to counter China's influence.
Exactly. And one more thing. They want to bring manufacturing jobs back to America. Invest in our industrial base. Reduce our reliance on China for critical goods.
Rebuild American strength. Become more self-sufficient.
That's the goal. So there you have it, the conservative vision for a wide range of policy areas.
Wow, the mandate for leadership really does cover a lot of ground. Reforming the IRS, restructuring the VA, getting tough on China, and so much more.
It's a bold vision for sure. And as requested, we dug deep into their recommendations for the Treasury Department and the Small Business Administration. Lots to think about here.
Absolutely, and we hope you'll continue to explore these ideas with us. Visit www.kmtcminds.com for more in-depth analysis. And thank you for joining us on this deep dive.